It is my distinct pleasure to present to you the power of electronic mediated communication, featuring blogs, Facebook, voice threads, and discussions for crystallizing, negotiating, and ultimately embracing the student's real truth. Hello, I am Dr. Gilbert Duenas from Auburn University at Montgomery, and welcome to this online presentation. In this presentation, I'd like to address several theoretical issues that frame the integration of technology with the study of the social studies. Secondly, I'd like to talk about our research focus that underscored efforts to engage our students' learning via two separate research studies. Third, I'd like to highlight examples of students' voices via various online social media tools and what we gained as a result of these two studies. Last, I'd like to talk about a variety of lessons learned, and there were several, as well as milestones that we were able to achieve, and the importance of this particular research to others. I'd like to now speak to the theoretical framework that underscored our research. First of all, the research indicates that our students' expectations for learning are constantly changing. Their expectations for current and certainly for relevant information is only part of what they expect. They also expect to learn from one another. To learn from one another in and certainly outside the classroom. And those online tools that they certainly value are tools that merge various forms of data, image, text, music, and so forth. A second key point in this research was the idea that in-depth, critical, and certainly what we classify as reflective dialogue on complex, riveting issues of the day literally relies on a community of learners, on certainly a variety of student voices that bring forward prior knowledge and experience, certainly voices that go beyond the traditional classroom. A third point is this idea of embracing all voices, of allowing all participants to share the same platform, to literally see eye to eye. We believe that, as the literature indicates, that it is an important factor for individuals to come forward and share their point of view. And sharing this discourse parity is important to bring into the forefront those issues involving, for example, social injustice, involving equity in the classroom, and so forth. I'd like to turn your attention to other theoretical constructs in this research study, one being the notion of that certainly as classroom instructors, that we periodically review what we are doing and certainly reform pedagogical practices that allow students to construct their own knowledge and certainly have a greater influence over their school learning, not to mention their lifelong learning. And certainly in line with the research, it is a pivotal point behind any effort to embrace the student's voice. Another point is this notion of allowing our students to work together, to offer each other support, feedback, that there be, if we might characterize it as a give and take discourse, thus enabling them to share at a certain plateau, at a certain level, a dialogic space on what truly matters. It is just as important that there be candor and openness of individual perspectives, a sharing of life stories, a discussion of special traditions that serve to broaden each other's awareness of cultural diversity. And of course, the final point here, that regardless of the time of day, the distance, regardless of what tool was being used, the key point here was of bringing forward into discussion distinct voices. These were all key points that underlied our research. Speaking to our first study, which began in fall of 2012, this was a collaborative research study involving an instructional designer at our university and myself over a 60-day period, focusing, of course, on the use of distinct online social media tools. Our participants consisted of 18 students, all elementary school teachers enrolled in a graduate social studies class. The group of 18 was randomly divided into 4 groups. You can see that there are various data collection methods all within the Blackboard platform. These topics that we discussed originally were derived from my own ideas, but through discussion, online discussion I might add, through ideas that students had, these topics moved from instructor-led, which was my expectation, to student-directed, and you can see that our focus moved from looking at each other as distinct individuals and what was certainly our cultural lens, family stories, and certainly the influence of technology in our everyday lives. And the students' reflections were noted in weekly journals and ultimately showcased in an end of class presentation before a large audience. In using the discussion forum, you can see a sampling of questions that were put forward. I just like to highlight not so much the questions themselves, but rather some of the sentiment in these questions. The students essentially were looking at these questions as an important outlet that allowed for their true voices, sometimes very intense voices, sometimes very surprising voices, to come forward at moments that they felt comfortable, within that segment of the conversation. It was just as important that we learn how these tools affected the students' sense that they were part of a classroom community, that their role was being acknowledged not just because they were part of a class, but that others truly valued what they had to say. In a sense, and I'm speaking to the final point here, that students were looking for how this technology that we're experimenting with, whether this technology would enable them not only to say something of value, but also to be connected to the points being made by others. That this technology, in a nutshell, would enable them to be able to say what they wanted, but to be able to have a way to say it that crystallized their true sentiments. In the use of voice threads, we asked our students, on average, to limit their voice thread to approximately 200 words. Some spoke a little less, others a bit more. What was most interesting about this social media tool is that over time, students began to appreciate each other's voice. Their voices consisted of not just a collection of words, but pauses. It consisted of inflections. It consisted of intensity, of emotion. It consisted of a wide spectrum of the communication process. And through all of this, through the listening of each other's voices, it was very interesting that students were learning quite a bit about each other that may not have been possible had we been in the classroom where we were listening, but we did not have a record of each other's voices. In this next slide, entitled Unabridged Voices of Students, you see a sampling of the students' sentiment from the very beginning, during, and through the end of this experiment in terms of using a variety of online tools. We were looking for their ideas, their honest reactions, their interpretations, their sense of whether this study, this effort to use a variety of computer-mediated communication tools had any bearing on their learning, their sense of learning, and certainly their ability to communicate with one another. In sum, what we were looking for is what they had experienced. Was it significant to who they were in this dialogue? Was it important to them as part of the learning of social studies? In our second research study, as you can see, we had a different composite of participants. We had 16 graduate social studies students, but we also brought into the conversation 10 Chinese university students. You can see that our 16 graduate students, that in the majority were pre-service teachers. Also, amongst the 10 Chinese students, all of them were enrolled full-time at our university, enrolled in various degree programs. Again, all students between both groups randomly paired. It was important for us to hold an upfront icebreaker in order to have those initial introductions made. Various data collection methods, as in our first study, were used. A slightly different approach here. We did use discussion forums, blogs, but in this instance, we introduced a class Facebook page. We did, of course, take into account privacy settings. Based on the previous study, we were able to move more easily between various topics as well, and again, reflections from the students were maintained throughout the study and shared at the very end. In conducting the discussion forum segment of the study, the students moved from what might be considered relatively safe topics, such as you can see, what was your favorite day of the week, explain your choice, to more complex, more sophisticated, essentially topics that called for a more critical reflection of what needed to be said. Here, I will note that approximately 30 postings were recorded. You will note under the blog postings that there were other kinds of issues discussed. Each one of these questions, along with several others, brought out the student's perspective. We were looking for much more involvement, and in fact, it was very interesting to us that we had over 55 postings, and it may be, and we're still looking at the data, but it may be that under the blog postings, the students were encouraged to add images that perhaps they had at home, or they had on, for example, their own computer, or they drew from some other source. But the fact that they added images in which represented a certain level of knowledge or experience brought out a host of reactions and certainly many more postings.